Hello and welcome. My name is Biagio Mazza, Pastoral Associate at St. Sabina Parish in Belton, Missouri, and I'm here to welcome you to another Do You Know series question. As we continue our history of the Mass, today's Do You Know question is, do you know how the Mass changed in the late medieval period? The late medieval period is roughly from the year 1000 to about 1500. And during this period, many changes occurred in the social, cultural, and theological world that impacted the liturgy greatly. In the previous period, oftentimes referred to as the Dark Ages, the early medieval period, there wasn't much of a focus on revival and renewal. But by the year 1000, you had a number of people, especially within the papacy and church hierarchy, who moved towards revival and renewal of culture, knowledge, and so on. And this is also, by the 12th and 13th century, this is the age of Thomas Aquinas, of Francis, of Dominic, the age of the Summas. These were attempts at organizing and ordering theological knowledge and sophistication with regards to theology and so on. With regards to the Eucharist, as I said, was primarily into the hands of the clergy, and a great deal of speculation was had with regards to the Eucharist as an object, especially how Christ was present and the real presence in the Eucharist. And what soon developed was the doctrine of concomitance, in which they said that not only is Christ fully present in both bread and wine, but is fully present in each one separately. As a result of this proposition in theological thinking, this resulted in essentially removing the cup from the people. One was the doctrine of concomitance. The other was the whole issue of the continual fear of spilling the wine. And so as a result, the cup was removed, and now communion was received only under one species, namely the host, the bread itself. And so we have, as a matter of fact, it's fascinating, we have artwork at this period of time that actually shows Jesus at the Last Supper distributing communion from a ciborium with white wafers, putting them on the disciples' tongues as they knelt in front of him. So this became the whole notion and the whole practice of now receiving communion. The fear of a distant God, by the way, also, and God is totally distant, Jesus as totally divine, led to a sense of unworthiness on the part of the people. And so what started to happen, fewer and fewer people started to participate in the reception of Eucharist, so much so in the year 1215 at the Fourth Lateran Council, the Church had to insist that people had to go to communion at least once a year, whether they liked it or not. There was an obligation, which eventually became known as the Easter duty, and so on. Beautiful Gothic churches were built at this particular time, which developed the awesomeness and the majesty of worship, and heaven was to be come close to us and we to God, but they were not very good at engaging participation on the part of the people in the liturgy. What actually developed too, they actually began to put what they call giant rood screens. These are screens that were put in front of the altar with crosses on top that began to block the view of the action of what was happening at the altar and so on. Eucharist as an object became so overwhelming with the fear, awe, and reverence that is because people were no longer participating, they were trying to figure out how to best receive graces from Eucharist. And what began to develop as a theological principle, which today we would call ocular communion. This is communion done not so much by physically participating in the reception of the bread, but rather looking at the host and getting graces from that. All sorts of directives were given about the graces of looking at the host and reverencing the host just by mere looking at it. As a matter of fact, what started to happen, genuflection now, whenever you were in the presence of the host. Around this particular time, too, elevations were increased. By the 13th century, elevation of the host and the cup were introduced so that people could see it and could reverence and observe it. If there is even, we know also people who were sitting in the back of church who couldn't see, that would yell up to Father to say, "Father, could you raise it up higher? I can't see it so well," and so on. Bells were introduced at this particular time to alert people to the elevation, simply because it was the high point of the Mass for them. As a matter of fact, there were people who stayed at Mass up to the elevation and the consecration, and then they would leave immediately and run to another church to observe another consecration, because that was seen as the highlight of liturgical celebration. So we therefore rise. The many devotions arose out of this practice, namely benediction, Corpus Christi procession, 40 hours. Monstrances were introduced to display large hosts so that people could see it better. Corpus Christi procession, where you brought the host and the monstrance through the streets so that people could see, worship, and adore it. All these things really minimize the physical participation in receiving the host, but really increased significantly this ocular devotion to the host, so much so that many of these devotions really became more significant than the Mass itself. And one final thing that really led to all sorts of abuses was the introduction of masses for special occasions, the special votive masses and so on, especially masses for the dead, for example, so that we have special chapels, special altars where guilds, families claimed that these were their altars and this was their Mass, and so on. We even had Mass priests whose primary role was exactly to say Mass from the time they got up to the time they went to bed for special intentions. Could say anywhere from 50, 60, 70 Masses a day, and so on, removed from any participation on the part of the people. Rood screens grew to such a large extent that it literally blocked all the actions on the altar, separating the people even further from the actual action of the liturgy and participation in it. All these abuses will lead to many people in the church calling for reform and to get back to the original inspiration of what the liturgy was about. This went on for centuries, and ultimately many were not successful in calling for reform until a young man, Martin Luther, is successful in his reform, unfortunately at the price of splitting the church. But reform was called, and I hope you will return again to more Do You Know series question as we continue our history of the Mass focused on the call for reform of Martin Luther and how the church responded at that particular time. Thank you very much.